Kia ora tātou katoa. Aki mana whenua, tēnā koutou. Thanks, Peter, for that introduction. I'm Paul Dansted, Director of Food Regulation from New Zealand Food Safety, which is part of MPI. So our function, we set the rules for food safety and labelling, etc. And we will also vigorously defend those rules because integrity of that system is important. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm basically going to talk about the labelling part of our system, and I'm going to start from the top, work my way down. So the general food standard setting system, particularly around labelling, then a little bit more about labelling of Manuka honey particularly, and specifically for export, and then there are some specific market requirements that I want to get into, and then just a little bit about exporting and how that works. So firstly, the Food Standards Code. So Australia and New Zealand, we have a joint food standard setting system, and this is under a joint treaty between Australia and New Zealand. We develop food standards together for labelling and composition, and that's great because what that means is that when the standards are set in both countries, across all the 8 jurisdictions and territories in Australia and in New Zealand, we've got the same labelling and composition requirements. So what that means is that anything that can be sold here can be legally sold there and vice versa. The specific standard that applies to honey, that's standard 2.8.2, that defines what is honey, and it also specifies some of the naming requirements. And I should mention at this stage, I wasn't expecting to, but that interesting conversation we had before about health claims, etc., that is specifically regulated under the Food Standards Code. So there is a pathway. If someone can substantiate a claim, a health claim as we call it, there is a pathway under the Food Standards Code to make that sort of claim. I do need to say that at this point in time, no such claim has been substantiated. I just heard a comment down from the audience. There is a pathway people can follow. The bar is set very high. It is hard to make those sort of claims because you're effectively competing with medicines in that case. Anyway, I just want to say that these are the base labelling requirements for sale of any foods actually in New Zealand and Australia, and that's a specific standard for honey. Now, I think what you're probably more interested in are the export requirements, and here I'm going to diverge into 3 parts. Our general export requirements, some market-specific requirements, and then there are some other ones I just want you to be aware of. So you're all aware of the GREPs, as we call it. Those are the general requirements for export. This is a standard that we issued a little while back. This is where the Manuka definition is specified, but it sets a number of other requirements around processing and traceability, audit, etc., to ensure integrity around that standard. I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but as you're aware, there are 2 categories under that standard, or 3 categories. There is what is monofloral Manuka honey, there is multifloral Manuka honey, and then there is what cannot be classified as Manuka. Now, I just want to stress, this standard doesn't specify how you market your product. It defines categories in the standard, but it doesn't prescribe what you put on your label. That's a marketing thing, and that's up to you. It just needs to be truthful, and it can't breach that standard. Now that's specified in part 5.2 of that standard. It's freely available. Feel free to have a chat to our guys at the stand if you want to talk about it in further detail. I just want to lay that out for you. I think we're getting a little bit of feedback up here. Can you guys hear that? Go on. I'll step back a bit. Okay. Now some market-specific requirements. So the GREPs, the general requirements, is just what covers all exports. But we trade with about 190 countries. Each one of those countries is, of course, a sovereign nation. They have their own laws. They have their own labelling laws, their own compositional requirements, and a whole bunch of other laws. Occasionally, we need to negotiate special access into those countries, and we then need to regulate our exports into those countries. And we call those requirements OMARs, which stands for Overseas Market Access Requirements. Sometimes those OMARs include certification, And what that means is to get your product into that country, you need a passport issued by us. So none of you would consider going to another country, would you, and just turning up at the border without a passport. What people often don't realise is that for many products exported from New Zealand, it's the same situation. Your product turns up at their border. If it doesn't have one of our passports, one of our export certificates, it's not going to cross the border. Not all markets. The US doesn't require it, for example, but a number of our biggest markets do. So any country in the EU and China, they do require export certification, and that goes through our electronic certification system. Sometimes these OMAs also require additional labelling. Now that gets your product over the importing country border, that assurance from MPI, from the New Zealand government to the importing country government. But once it's in that country, there are a whole lot of other laws you need to meet. And there are commercial requirements as well, which have nothing to do with MPI. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit shortly. Just want to stress that's really important for you guys to understand that, so you don't get in trouble once your product hits the market. So in terms of who does what we do as MPI, obviously we set the New Zealand standard. We set some requirements that will facilitate entry of your product into overseas countries. We talk directly to importing countries if there are problems getting access, and we sometimes set rules which are agreed between us and the importing country about what kind of product can legitimately get in there. Those of you who export are responsible for meeting those requirements, of course. You're also responsible for meeting all the other requirements that you might come across in that importing country. And the way we like to think of that, I describe the export certificate as like a passport. So a passport will get you into a country, but once you're in the country, you've got a whole lot of other laws you need to meet. If you're a tourist, you've got to meet the traffic laws, there are rules around how you behave, how you dress, all sorts of other things. We don't necessarily agree with them, but they are the importing country laws. Same thing with your product. Once your product's over the border, there are potentially a whole lot of other rules you need to meet. We don't necessarily have anything to do with that. But you do need to be aware of that. So just some steps that most of you will already be aware of this, but I just want to step through it. If you're exporting bee products, any bee product, honey included, need to register as an exporter. You need to be aware of the overseas market access requirements for those specific countries. Sometimes you will need an export certificate. That's through our APE cert system. And the critical bit is that you need to understand the importing country requirements. And the best way of doing that, have a good relationship with your importer, do your due diligence, understand what's going on. Be aware, of course, of the commercial expectations of your client. That shouldn't need saying, but that's not an MPI thing. And just be aware of the labelling and quality requirements of that importing country as well. So in terms of where you can get help, it's complex. It's not easy getting product into overseas countries or meeting their requirements. We have what we call our Export Regulatory Advice Service. Some of the team are around, in fact I can see some of them in the audience. I think we have 2 or 3 of them at our stand in the middle out there. They'll be happy to talk to you about general requirements or potentially the specific requirements. We've also provided some guidance about the general requirements for export and some more hopefully useful information for you about labelling. There are a bunch of other agencies as well that can help here. NZTE, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, has been mentioned a few times. You can either approach them directly or approach us and we can point you in the right direction. And the really critical bit I just want to finish with, this is not an MPI responsibility, but make sure that you are talking to each other. You've got a good understanding of the limitations and the restrictions of those markets, and make sure you're in good contact with your and have a good relationship with your importing agent. That should be your primary source of information in this area. So I hope that's useful. That's it from me. 18 seconds. Do we have any questions?
The essence of that is that MPI provides the Greeks and the OMARs and negotiates access into markets, or our, as Paul characterised it, our passport into those individual markets. But it's the exporters and their customers' responsibility for meeting those individual in-market country requirements, including, of course, labelling requirements. And they are complex, particularly when you get into individual markets, and then potentially you get into individual customer, individual retailer requirements that they want to be satisfied. So while Paul's here, are there any questions, please, for Paul? And please, if you just identify yourself when you stand.
This is to Paul and maybe to some other members of the panel. Mike Everly, Bees and Trees Honey. So we produce in Taranaki and then we retail our brand in the U.S. market. So with the labeling standards, I understand you said labels have to be truthful, and that's important. Whose job, if it's not MPI, and I appreciate where you guys drew the line with how far you were going to go, but is it Apiculture New Zealand, or whose job is it to regulate what's truthful but what's intentionally deceptive? And what I mean by that is the product, and I see this probably 80% of what's in the US market, it's got the number 15 plus on it, but in front of 15 plus, it's got the word active, or it's got the word bioactive, or it's got the word K factor, okay? So there's nobody with a straight face that can say that that grading system that they've created is not intentionally trying to deceive the consumer into assuming it's a UMF 15 plus honey. And some of them now on the back of the label will say, this honey is guaranteed to have a minimum of 83 milligrams per kilogram of methyl glyoxal, but it's a 15 plus. So if we could fix that problem, that would get 90% of the problem. The consumers can figure out UMF versus MGO, especially now that a lot of us are starting to dual label, but they can't figure out these other things. So isn't there a role for some industry group or MPI to weigh into that part of the problem?
Thanks, that's a really good question. So there's a really simple answer and there's a slightly more complex answer. The simple answer is that New Zealand and the New Zealand government has jurisdiction here and it's limited to our borders. It'll come as no surprise to you, jurisdiction in the US market is the US government, and it's obviously state and probably that will be state jurisdiction. So we don't have a role there. That's the simple answer. The more complex answer is it can be tricky understanding what is considered truthful in a particular market because the threshold is different depending on who your customers are. I think there is an opportunity there for those industries, those companies that are selling into that market to have a common understanding of what's legitimate. Obviously they want to compete with each other as well, but I think there is potential to have a better understanding of what are legitimate claims, commercial claims in that market.
Russell Berry.
Hey Russell.
There's quite a lot of comb honey in freezers around New Zealand. We're all waiting for the negotiations between MPI and China. How are you getting on with them? When are we going to get it back into China?
Sorry, I didn't hear your question, Russell. Where are we?
When are we going to get comb honey back into China again? We've been told that it's going to wait till after other things. Wasn't very important, but there's billions of dollars worth of comb honey sitting around New Zealand.
So, sorry, I don't know the specifics of that,
okay.
Russell. I'll need to look into that.
That's fine.
I have noticed there's not a whole lot of comb honey being sold in New Zealand. I assume that's because of Tooten.
No, we produce it for export.
Okay.
There is a lot of comb honey being sold in New Zealand, but there's a lot of good export product waiting to go out.
I'll have to look into that for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Russell.
Any other questions for Paul? Otherwise, thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
And Jacob.